Hey everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from March 15th, 2024, and I'm recording this on Friday the 13th of September 2024. So, as always, I give you those dates so you know when this information is actually most relevant. And as always, we're looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week. We do this every week. We look back. We've been doing it for over 5 years. We look at the hot comics from 6 months ago and see how they're performing in the market now, just 6 months later, compared to what they were doing then. We do this so that we can learn, understand what factors make books hot, what causes people to chase books, and then how do they react in the market once that news or information dies down. Should we have been patient? Should we have chased the books in the moment? This week we got 18 books to talk about between the two lists, so let's dig in and see if we can learn anything. First up, we have one of our only 2 books that are on both lists this week, and it's Dragon Ball Z #1 from 1998. This is the first Dragon Ball Z comic in America, and had to do, and it's like the first Gohan, that kind of stuff. And this was hitting the list because of the passing of Akira Toriyama, the writer behind Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. So he passed away back in the spring at a relatively young age, and it caused a lot of interest in this book. Back then, raw copies were 100 to 150, 9.8s were going for around 800. And really the book that wasn't a huge bump. It was a big bump in sales, but not a huge bump in value back then. Now it's a $50 to $200 book, depending on your condition on a raw side. No recent 9.8 sales to report, but a 9.6 went for 400. So this is kind of a steady and worth it. Dragon Ball is a very beloved franchise for a lot of folks around my age. When it was first coming to America and Toonami on Cartoon Network. And so there's a lot of big fans. I know it's got a new Dragon Ball Super and that kind of stuff has continued in some younger generations. I think I was about the oldest people that really got into Dragon Ball back then. So, but yeah, he passed away, and there was a lot of people buying this book just because they love the series, and we're sad to see him pass. Next, we have one CGC signing book hitting the list. Basically, Frank Miller was announced to be doing a signing, and I think one of the weeks, I think there's a Wolverine on here, but this week it was Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. #1 was hitting the list because there was just a big jump in sales of people trying to get copies to send in for the signing, is at least their justification for why they thought it was hitting the list. Back then, raw copies were going for around 200, and 9.8 went for 1,000. Now it's about a $50 to $150 book. 9.8, 7 to 900. So we're down, and I'll be back from that little bump back in the spring, and really just kind of back to where this book typically sits. You will notice, I forgot to mention earlier, I did not do a Cash or Trash this week back in the spring. Don't remember why, but didn't get one done, so there's no what JP said this week, just what happened at the bottom. All right, next we have Scarlet #1 from 2010. This is the Brian Michael Bendis book. This was an interesting one to hit the list. Basically, Key Collector gave an alert on it, so it hit the list with a bunch of sales because it wasn't one of the series listed as part of his deal with Amazon. It had been previously optioned a few years ago, hadn't heard anything about it, and it wasn't on the list, so he's like, oh, be on the alert. So bunch of sales back then. $12 is all it was averaging. 9.8 went for 82, which is pretty low for 9.8 of anything. Well, no recent sales right now, so we're going to call this down a trap. The prices on this book, it is available for cheap, and just no recent sales at all on eBay on this particular one. Next, we have other option news. We have 8 Billion Genies, #1, and this we got news that Amazon and Seth Rogen's production company were both working on this to turn this into, a miniseries or a movie, or where they were going with this for sure, because it is a pretty short story. Probably some sort of series. But back then, raw copies were going for 20 to 40, with a 9.8 going for 120. And now it's still setting about 20 to 40. 9.8 still backed up a little bit, 90 to 100 on those. So we're going to call it steady, and I'll be back, because most of the sales are still raw, and most of them are still right in that same range. And even the 9.8s have only backed up just a slight tick here. This book has been pretty steady now for a long time in this $20 to $40 range. A lot of people love this series, and despite it ending, it's held value better than typically does once we move away from a series like this. So, which is kind of impressive, really. Next, we have some more movie option news. We have Watch Dogs #1. This is another game adaptation comic that is basically the game's going to be turned into a movie. This is the first comic adaptation of that game, and it was going for $15 to $25 back then. Now the only recent sales were literally $4. There was like 3 or 4, maybe 5 sales that were all right at $4. So yeah, this is a dumpster fire. No reason to have bought this book back then. I don't think there's been any new news. And given I know The Last of Us made people believe, and Super Mario and stuff made people believe that they could get video game adaptations right, and then the last couple ones have not been so good. So we'll see. All right, next we have The Crow, and this was hitting the list because we were getting the trailer drop for the new movie, which I think is out and got very poor reviews. But back then it was based on the trailer, and so people were chasing this book. But this is a book that has a ton of value and has had a ton of value for a long time. It's a super difficult book to get in high condition because it wasn't high paper quality. It's all black. It's a very tough book. So it's always had pretty high value no matter what. And back then, again, I didn't do the look back, so it was saying an average of $1,200 from Tom, which is usually not very accurate for a book this old. 9.4 went for $1,360. So that tells you that $1,200 average is probably nothing you can really judge off of. So what's it doing now? Raw copies two to all the way up to $1,700. But those are just a couple of really, really nice copies that were over 1,000. Most of the sales were more like 2 to 5. And then 9.4, 950, and 1,400, 2 sales there. I will say there were some 9.6 sales for less recently for less than that $1,400 sale on the 9.4. So yeah, it's right in that range. We're going to call it kind of steady, and I'll be back here. Hard to judge for sure. I would guess it's maybe down, and I'll be back. But anyway, The Crow, this is a book that has a ton of value because there's not a lot of copies that are in high grade, and just not a lot of copies, period. Next, we're going to move into covers. We don't have a ton of covers this week, but a couple. First up, we have a repeat from last week. We have Spawn number 350. This is the one per store Todd McFarlane signed variant. Last week when it was hitting the list, it was kind of pre-sales, 350 to 600. Or initial sales, and got all the way up to 600. By this point, it had settled in right at 300 to 400, and that's still where this book is going. 275 to 400 on recent sales. So this is very much steady, and I'll be back. Don't really gain anything. Haven't lost a lot, but more of the sales were down toward that 300 mark than up toward the 400 mark. So that's why I put I'll be back. But yeah, Spawn 350 signed by McFarlane, still going for good value. Next, we have Invincible Iron Man number 15. The Ruin 1 in 25 of Emma Frost in an Iron Man suit. And basically, yeah, this Emma Frost cover. This is, of course, back in the storyline where they were involved for sort of real reasons. That's all already played out, less than a year of them being together. But anyway, yeah, back then, this 125 was going for 80 plus. Now it's a $30 to $55 book, so this is a dumpster fire. It's less than half of what it was going for back then. Yeah, no reason to have chased this 1 in 25 back then. All right, 2 more cover/buzz books. First up, we have Giant Size Spider-Gwen number 1, the Betsy Cola 1 in 25, first appearance of Doc Ock's adopted son, which I still don't know the name of, but this is on the list for the second week in a row. Last week, the 1 in 25 was on the list at 30 to 45. And by the second week, it was pushing up around 50. Now it's still a 30 to 50, 30 and 50 for recent sales. So just 2 sales again, only $30 and $50. So we're still going to call us down, and I'll be back. I think there are listings for less than that $50 mark. No reason to have chased this at the time. Next, we have I Heart Skull Crusher number 1. The Alyssa Zono 1 per store, and basically the only difference between this and one of the regular covers is that it is the virgin version of the cover. This 1 per store was going 10 to 20 back then. Now it's 10 to 15. Again, I'm going to put this as down, and I'll be back because it's not pushing the heights it once was. Not a lot of interest, not a lot of sales here. All right. With that, a couple more buzz covers. We got the Feral Ashcan number 1, from the Stray Dogs authors. People were really interested in this Ashcan version of this new series from those two authors. The raw copies back then, for this, again on the list, second week in a row, was 65 to 75 after being like 40 to 70 last week. It settled in on that upper portion of the range. Recent sales here, again, just two recent sales, $60 and $99 for those two sales. So we're going to call it steady and worth it. One sale slightly below where it was at, one sale above, but listings in that range that aren't selling, so we'll just call it steady and worth it. Next, we have another copy of Feral, number 1, but this time it's the Comics Pro variant that was given away at a Comics Pro, not really con, but meeting kind of thing that you got to be like a store owner and that kind of stuff to be at, I believe, or like an LCS kind of thing to be invited to those. Back then, the raw copies after that were going for 100 to 150. Now, again, the only two recent sales, a raw copy went for 50, a 9.8 went for 200. Again, listings are less than that 1 to 150 from before. So we're going to call this down in a dumpster fire. No reason to have chased this. And really, I don't know about anybody else, but I don't remember ever hearing anything about this series after this initial hit in the list, that it was any good or that anybody talked about it. Definitely not to the level that people talked about Stray Dogs. All right, with that, we're moving solely into like comic buzz stuff, and we got Spider-Man number 1 from 2012, the first meeting of Miles and Peter, and on the list for the second week in a row because the new series was getting released. The new Spider-Man series was starting to come out. With both of them in the book, and it was getting pretty good reviews initially, better than any of the other Spider books, really. Back then, raw copies were going 20 to 30, 9.8 pushing up to 95, almost $100. Now it's a $5 to $15 book, 9.8, 75. This is a trap. It's kind of a fun Spider-Man book, but not really a huge key or anything I would pay big money for. I'd look for this in back issue bins if I could find it. Next, we have Star Wars, The High Republic Adventures, number 4. And basically, we were into phase 3 of the High Republic stuff. And this is a book that supposedly had like 8 first appearances in it. I didn't write any of them down because I was dubious of how many of them would really matter. Back then, raw copies right after it came out, we're going for 10 to 20 on this A cover. And now it's a $2 to $12 book with more sales toward the $2 end than the $12 end. So yeah, down in a trap, borderline dumpster fire on this one as well. Next, we have X-Men number 1 from 1991. Not sure what was going on here. There was just a bunch of sales on this book, but there's a bunch of these books. There's always some sales on this book. They weren't really specific on a cover here. This was the cover they showed, so this is the cover I'm showing, but the way they talked about it, I think it was all covers, and supposedly this was just hitting the list because X-Men From the Ashes was getting ready to start. So the big Krakoa era was coming to an end. We were getting a relaunch of X-Men and all the different titles, and basically it was prompting people to go back and get another relaunch of X-Men, like the most printed book of all time. Back then it was still $5, 9.8, 35 to 165, which was really an overpay on an X-Men number 1 for 9.8 on that 165 end, but now it's a $5 to $15 book. So raw copies cost you a little more depending on the version and the newsstand, that kind of stuff. 9.8, $75 to $100 here. We're going to just call this steady. I'll be back. Raw copies, this is basically what this book is always going for. There was a couple of sales there that was higher back then, but for the 9.8, but overall, it's fine. It's the same. Next, we have Uncanny X-Men number 200, The Trial of Magneto, and basically we were getting news that indicated that was probably going to be one of the storylines they tackled in, at that point, the upcoming X-Men 97 animated series, and it was one of the episodes. I believe the second episode was dedicated to the Trial of Magneto kind of story. Back then, raw copies of this book were going for 15, a 9.8 went for 60. Now it's a $5 to $15 book, raw. 9.8, 75 to 125 on the recent sales, so up a little bit. A little sustained interest here that more than was there, but overall we're just going to call this another steady, and then I'll be back, as most of the sales are raw, and you can get this book for really cheap. All right, 2 books left, both related to the MCU. We got Fantastic Four Annual number 3 from 1965, The Wedding of Reed and Sue. they weren't actually married when they first started, when Fantastic Four came out. It took to this point for them to actually finally get married. And this was hitting the list because we had casting for the FF movie back then. This is another one where I got an average from Tom that doesn't generally make sense. The average was 450, but a 6.5 was only costing a 150 of this book from the 60s. Raw copies right now, 20 to 150 bucks for raw copies. Looking at them, at least within the range of grade that currently was or were recently sold. No recent 6.5 sales to touch on, but a 6.0 went for 100. So this is another one I'm just going to call steady, and I'll be back. This book is setting pretty much where it just sets, based on trends and that kind of stuff that I can find. And our last book is Hulk #1 from 2008. First cover appearance of Red Hulk. Reminder, he appears on this cover, but he does not appear actually in the book until, I think it's issue 2, but I'm not 100%. It might even be issue 3. Raw copies back then were going for 70 to 90 based on kind of confirmation Harrison Ford was going to be the Red Hulk and the upcoming Captain America, I think, first movie. And now raw copies are 40 to 100, 9.8, 250 to 350, which is pretty close to where it's been now for a while. So we're going to call this another steady, and I'll be back. You can find some deals. So there was no reason to really chase, but hasn't really gained or lost very much. So that is this week's list. We've talked about the 18 books. I really need to go get a drink of water. So we're going to leave it right here. Well, thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time. Later.